I cut off every single one of my relatives from my life, blocked their bank accounts, and changed the locks on my house the very second I found out that my 11-year-old son had spent Christmas dinner completely alone in a freezing garage while the rest of the real family was busy unwrapping expensive gifts by the fireplace in the living room. It all started about 3 weeks ago when my company suddenly hit me with an emergency business trip to Chicago, and I honestly had no other choice but to trust my son Isaiah to my parents Robert and Martha. I have always known deep down that they looked at my decision to adopt a black child with a certain level of coldness and detachment, but I was naive enough to believe that over the course of 11 years, their hearts had finally thawed and they had grown to love this boy just as much as I do. Isaiah is my entire world. He came into my life when I was only 23 years old, and since that day, I have built every single minute of my existence around him, doing everything in my power to ensure he feels safe, wanted, and loved in a world that isn't always kind. My sister Sarah has always been the golden child of our family, the one who did everything by the book, and she has 2 biological children, Leo and Chloe, whom my parents absolutely worship, showering them with constant attention and money every chance they get. When I called my mother and asked if Isaiah could stay with them for a week while I attended those conferences, she responded in a dry, clipped tone, saying that Christmas is a time for family, and that they would manage just fine. I boarded that plane with a heavy heart and a knot in my stomach, but I kept telling myself that I was being paranoid, that they were his grandparents, and that the bond we had built over a decade was stronger than any lingering prejudice, even though a voice in the back of my mind told me I was making a massive mistake. This entire month has turned into one long, waking nightmare that began the moment I stepped onto that aircraft, completely unaware that I was leaving my child in a house where he was viewed as an outsider, a guest who had overstayed his welcome, and a second-class citizen. During my time in Chicago, I tried to stay focused on work, but the atmosphere during our nightly phone calls felt increasingly off. I would call around 7 p.m., and Isaiah would sound incredibly quiet, his voice small and distant, giving me one-word answers and claiming he was just tired from playing outside or that he was busy with his gaming console. I never heard the laughter of his cousins in the background, never heard the clinking of dishes or the festive music that usually fills my parents' home during the holidays, but I convinced myself it was just bad reception or that he was simply missing home. My parents live in this massive, sprawling house in the suburbs that they always bragged about, a place with more than enough room for everyone, so I couldn't comprehend a scenario where my son would feel uncomfortable or out of place. But behind that polished facade of suburban perfection and family values, there was a deep-seated resentment toward me for not following their traditional path, for not marrying the right kind of guy from their social circle, and for choosing the path of single motherhood through adoption. Sarah often fueled this fire, making subtle passive-aggressive comments about how I was wasting my best years on someone who didn't share our DNA, treating my motherhood like it was some kind of rebellious phase I'd eventually grow out of. I spent years ignoring those stings, thinking time would eventually heal everything and they would see Isaiah for the kind, talented, and incredibly sensitive boy he actually is. But my absence for just 1 week ripped the bandages off those old wounds and revealed that to my parents, there is a very clear and jagged line between their own and that boy. I decided to fly back 2 days early to surprise everyone, wanting to catch the tail end of the Christmas Eve celebrations and take Isaiah home for our own little tradition. When I pulled up to the driveway, the house was glowing with festive lights, but I noticed the front door was bolted shut, and the only light coming from the back of the property was a dim, flickering bulb in the detached garage that my father used as a workshop and a graveyard for old, dusty furniture. I didn't have my keys because I had lent my spare set to Sarah months ago, so I walked around the side of the house and looked through the large dining room window. The sight inside shattered something in me that can never be fixed. My entire family was sitting around a table overflowing with food, a massive turkey in the center, candles burning, and everyone was laughing and sharing stories. But one chair was missing, and it wasn't a chair for me. There simply wasn't a place set for Isaiah, as if his existence had been completely erased from the family gathering. Panic and rage began to boil in my chest as I realized he wasn't in the house at all, and I ran toward the garage, my boots crunching loudly on the frozen grass. When I yanked the side door open, the smell of oil and cold, damp air hit me instantly, and there he was, my son, sitting on a hard wooden stool in his heavy winter parka, shivering as he tried to eat a bowl of cold, congealed pasta out of a plastic Tupperware container. He had a small space heater plugged in next to him, but it was barely doing anything against the December chill, and he looked so small and abandoned in the shadows that I felt like I couldn't breathe. He didn't cry when he saw me. He just looked down at his feet, his face flushed with a deep haunting sense of shame, as if he were the one who had done something wrong, as if he deserved to be exiled to the dark while everyone else celebrated. I didn't even walk into the main house to confront them then. I just grabbed his hand, threw his belongings into his duffel bag which had been tossed into a corner of the garage like trash, and led him straight to the car. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely get the key into the ignition, but the fire inside me was already burning everything to the ground, and I knew right then that no apology, no explanation, and no amount of regret would ever make this right. As we drove away into the night, the silence between us was deafening, a heavy, suffocating weight that made me realize this month wouldn't just be about a bad holiday. It was the end of our family as I knew it. The drive back to our house was the longest 40 minutes of my life, and the only sound was the hum of the tires on the wet pavement and Isaiah's shallow breathing next to me. I kept glancing over at him, hoping he would say something, yell at me, or even cry. But he just sat there staring out the window at the passing streetlights with a look of complete emptiness that broke my heart into a million pieces. When we finally got home, he didn't even ask for dinner. He just went straight to his room, closed the door, and I heard the lock click, which was a sound I had never heard from him in the 11 years we've been together. I sat in my dark kitchen for 3 hours, not moving, just staring at my phone as the notifications started rolling in from my family, starting with a confused text from my mother, asking why we had left without saying goodbye. Then came the calls from Sarah, then my father, and finally a group message that basically accused me of ruining the Christmas atmosphere with my dramatic exit and my unnecessary overreaction to a minor situation. They actually had the audacity to claim that Isaiah had requested to be in the garage because he wanted to play his games in peace, even though I knew for a fact that my son would never choose a freezing, dark shed over being with people. The next morning, the reality of the situation started to sink in, and I began to realize that this wasn't just a one-time mistake or a misunderstanding, but the result of years of suppressed resentment that had finally boiled over. I spent the next few days watching Isaiah retreat further into himself. He stopped eating properly, he wouldn't look me in the eye, and when I tried to bring up what happened, he would just shrug and say it didn't matter. But it did matter because I started finding things out that I hadn't noticed before, like the fact that Sarah had told her children that Isaiah wasn't their real cousin, and that he was just a guest who would eventually go away. I discovered this when I checked Isaiah's iPad and saw messages from Leo, my nephew, telling him that he shouldn't touch the toys under the tree because they were for the actual family, and not for people like him. My parents hadn't just allowed this, they had encouraged it by creating a hierarchy where my son was at the very bottom, a charity project they tolerated only because I was the one paying for their lifestyle. See, the part that makes this even more twisted is the financial dynamic that has existed for the last 5 years, since my father's business went under and I stepped in to save them. I am a senior partner at a wealth management firm, and I have been the one funding my parents' retirement, paying for Sarah's kids' private school tuitions, and even covering the mortgage on the very house where they just humiliated my son. They looked me in the face every month, took my money, and then treated my child like garbage the moment my back was turned, assuming I would never find out or that I was too weak to do anything about it. I spent that second week of the month in a state of cold, calculated fury, working with my lawyers and my bank to start the process of uncoupling our lives, which was much more complicated than I ever imagined. Every time I looked at a bank statement or a property deed, I saw the names of people who had betrayed the most innocent person in my life, and the guilt I felt for providing the platform for their cruelty was almost unbearable. Sarah called me on day 12, not to apologize, but to complain that her credit card had been declined at a high-end department store, while she was trying to buy post-Christmas clearance items. Her voice was so high-pitched and entitled, complaining about the embarrassment she felt in front of her friends, and she didn't even mention Isaiah until I brought him up myself. When I asked her how she could sit at that table and eat while my son was shivering in the garage, she literally laughed and said I was being too sensitive, and that the boy was fine because he has tougher skin than the rest of us. That comment was the final nail in the coffin, a clear indicator of the deep-seated racism and elitism that had been festering in my sister's mind, hidden behind expensive clothes and a fake suburban smile. I didn't yell at her. I just hung up and called my broker to freeze the trust account I had set up for my parents' expenses, knowing that the fallout would be catastrophic, but I didn't care anymore. By the middle of the third week, the house was silent, but the air was thick with the weight of what was coming, as my parents finally realized that the money had stopped flowing. They started showing up at my front door, ringing the bell for hours, sending me emails filled with pleas and then threats, moving from "we love you" to "how could you do this to your own flesh and blood," in the span of a single afternoon. They still didn't get it. They still thought this was about a missed dinner or a cold room, and they couldn't see that they had fundamentally destroyed the safety and trust of a child who had done nothing but love them. Isaiah started having nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night thinking he was back in the garage with the door locked, and every time I held him, I felt a new level of hatred for the people who had raised me. I realized then that I didn't even know who these people were anymore. Or perhaps I had never known them at all, and the woman I called Mom was just a stranger who used my child as a pawn in her sick game of family purity. I was preparing for a final confrontation, but there was a detail I hadn't told anyone yet, a piece of information about the adoption and the family history that I had kept buried for 11 years, and it was about to change everything. The third week began with a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the walls of our house, but that silence was violently shattered on Tuesday morning when my father used his old spare key to barge into my home before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. He didn't come alone. My mother and Sarah were right behind him, and they didn't look like people coming to make amends. They looked like debt collectors who had been insulted. They marched into my kitchen, and my mother immediately started talking about the humiliation I was causing them by freezing the trust accounts and how the neighbors were starting to ask questions about why their lawn service hadn't shown up. I stood there, looking at these three adults who had shared my life for decades, and I realized they didn't have a single ounce of remorse for what they did to Isaiah. All they cared about was the flow of cash that kept their comfortable lives moving. When I told them to leave, Sarah stepped forward and had the nerve to say that I was weaponizing my son's race to make them look like villains, and that the only reason Isaiah was in the garage was because he didn't fit the aesthetic of their traditional family Christmas photo. I felt a surge of adrenaline so sharp it made my vision blur, and I told them right then that if they ever mentioned his race or his place in this family again, I would not only cut the money but I would sue to recover the loans I'd given them over the last 5 years. My mother, Martha, sat down at my kitchen table as if she still had some authority over me and told me to sit down and be reasonable, which is her favorite way of telling me to shut up and do what I'm told. She looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Megan, you have to understand that for us, Sarah's children are our grandchildren, they carry our blood and our history, and while we tolerate your choice to play house with that boy, you cannot expect us to treat him the same." Hearing her say those words out loud so casually and so cruelly was like a physical blow to my chest that left me gasping for air, but I didn't let them see me crumble. I told her that if Isaiah wasn't her grandson, then I wasn't her daughter, and that the blood she was so proud of was currently being funded by the person she was insulting. The conflict escalated quickly as my father started screaming about how he built this family, and how I owed them everything because they allowed me to keep the boy in the first place without disowning me back then. It was a disgusting, raw display of the entitlement that had been rotting under the surface of our family dynamics for 11 years. And it was only getting worse because they realized their financial survival was at stake. The tension in the room was suffocating, and it only broke when Isaiah walked into the kitchen, his eyes red from lack of sleep, and saw the people who had locked him in a cold shed standing in his home. The look of pure terror on his face when he saw my father was something I will never forget. He literally backed away until he hit the wall, trembling so hard his teeth were chattering. Instead of apologizing, my mother just looked at him with this expression of annoyed pity and told him to go back to his room because the adults were talking, which was the exact moment I lost every bit of restraint I had left. I didn't scream, but my voice was a low, dangerous hiss as I told them that they had 5 minutes to get out of my house before I called the police and filed a restraining order that would include Sarah's house and the kids' school. Sarah started crying, that fake, manipulative sob she uses whenever she loses an argument, saying that I was destroying her children's futures by taking away their tuition money just because of a holiday misunderstanding. She actually blamed me for the trauma my son was experiencing, saying that if I hadn't made such a big deal out of the garage thing, Isaiah wouldn't even have noticed he was being excluded. They eventually left, but not before my father threatened to go to the press or my company to tell them I was unstable, and financially abusing my elderly parents, which was a laughably desperate move. But as I locked the door and changed the codes on the security system, I realized the month was far from over, and the worst was yet to come because Sarah wasn't going to go down without a fight. She started a smear campaign on social media, posting vague book updates about how heartless I was for cutting off her kids right before the new semester started. And she even got some of our extended family to start harassing me with texts. I felt like I was under siege in my own life, balancing the intense needs of a traumatized child with the legal warfare I was preparing to unleash on the people who raised me. The atmosphere in the house was paranoid. Every time a car drove by, Isaiah would jump, and I found myself sitting by the window at night, watching the street, waiting for the next move they would make. I was digging into our family's legal records and the original adoption paperwork to find a specific document I remembered seeing years ago, something that would give me the ultimate leverage. It was a document my father had signed when Isaiah was a baby, a piece of paper he had forgotten about but I hadn't, and it was the key to ending this war on my terms. By the end of the third week, the pressure was at a boiling point. The bank had notified my parents that their primary residence was at risk of foreclosure, because the special payment arrangement I had set up was now void. They were desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things, which I learned when I came home on Friday to find Sarah sitting on my porch with a lawyer, claiming that since I had abandoned the family, they were going to challenge my fitness as a mother. They were going to use my long work hours and the fact that I left Isaiah with them during the incident as proof that I was neglectful, trying to take the one thing that mattered to me to force me to keep paying their bills. I looked at the legal papers they handed me and felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. They didn't realize that by attacking my motherhood, they had just given me the permission I needed to destroy them completely. I had 1 week left in this miserable month to finish this, and I was going to make sure that by the time I was done, they would wish they had never even heard the name Isaiah, let alone locked him in a garage. The fourth week began with a legal letter arriving at my office that felt like a suicide note for my family's relationship with me. Sarah and my parents weren't just asking for money anymore. They were filing for a wellness intervention, claiming that my high-stress job and the recent instability of my behavior made me an unfit parent for Isaiah. They were actually trying to use the fact that I left him with them, the very people who abused him, as evidence that I have poor judgment and shouldn't be allowed to raise a child. It was a sick circular logic designed to keep me under their thumb, a desperate play to keep the tuition checks and mortgage payments coming by holding my son hostage in a legal battle. I spent 3 days locked in my home office with my own legal team, going through every text, every bank transfer, and every security camera clip from my parents' house that I had managed to download from their cloud storage before they changed the password. I was looking for the one thing they had forgotten about, a document from 11 years ago that my father had signed in a moment of extreme financial weakness when Isaiah was just an infant and I was the only one with a savings account. The twist they didn't see coming was that I didn't just adopt Isaiah through an agency. He was the biological son of my father's youngest brother, my Uncle David, who had passed away under tragic circumstances. My parents had been so ashamed of David's life, and the fact that he had a child with a woman they didn't approve of, that they forced me to keep the biological connection a secret from the rest of the world. They wanted the world to think I had just done a good deed by adopting a random child, rather than admitting that Isaiah was a blood relative, a true heir to the family name they were so obsessed with. But more importantly, when the adoption was finalized, my father had signed a co-responsibility and indemnity agreement, because he had tried to claim Isaiah as a dependent on his taxes for a business loan. In that document, which was filed under a different case number, he had explicitly acknowledged that Isaiah was his biological great-nephew and that he, Robert, would forfeit all rights to ever interfere in the child's upbringing or my finances if he ever showed gross negligence or moral turpitude regarding the child's welfare. On Wednesday, I invited them all to my house for what they thought was a settlement meeting. They showed up with Sarah's lawyer looking smug, as if they had already won and were just waiting for me to write the check that would make the fitness lawsuit go away. We sat in my dining room, the very place where Isaiah used to do his homework while my mom baked cookies and pretended to care, and I laid out the folder. I didn't start with the money or the garage incident. I started with the document from 11 years ago, the one that proved Isaiah was their own blood, the very thing they claimed was the reason they couldn't love him. The look on Sarah's face was one of pure shock. She had never been told that Isaiah was actually her cousin's son. that the DNA she was so proud of was the same DNA running through the boy she had left in a cold shed. My mother turned as white as a sheet, realizing that the secret they had buried to protect their reputation was now the weapon I was using to dismantle their lives. But I wasn't done. I leaned across the table and told them that I had more than just a forgotten paper. I had a voice recording of my father from 2 nights ago. I had installed a high-end baby monitor in Isaiah's room months ago because of his night terrors, and it had picked up a conversation my father had with Sarah when they broke into my house earlier that week. In the recording, my father can be heard clearly saying that he didn't give a damn about the boy, and that they just needed to squeeze Megan until she bleeds enough cash to cover the winter bills. I watched as Sarah's lawyer slowly closed his briefcase and looked at his clients with a mix of disgust and professional panic. The fitness lawsuit wasn't just dead. It was a criminal liability for extortion and harassment, and I had every intention of making sure the court saw every second of it. The room went silent, the kind of silence that precedes a total collapse. My father tried to bluster, tried to say it was all a joke or that he was just stressed, but I just pushed a second folder across the table. The eviction notice for their house and the final termination papers for Sarah's kids' tuition. I told them they had 48 hours to drop every legal claim, sign a lifetime no-contact agreement, and vacate the property I owned, or I would release the recording and the biological proof to every news outlet in the state. I gave them a choice. They could lose their dignity in private, or they could lose it in the most public, humiliating way possible while I sat back and watched their perfect world burn to the ground. As they left my house stumbling like they had been hit by a truck, I realized the month was almost over, and for the first time in years I could finally breathe, but the hardest part was still ahead of me. I had to go into Isaiah's room and explain to him that the people who hurt him were gone forever, but in doing so, I would have to reveal the truth about where he came from and the family that had tried to erase him before he was even born. The final few days of the month felt like the aftermath of a hurricane. Quiet, eerie, and filled with the wreckage of a life I thought I knew. My parents and Sarah signed everything. They didn't have a choice. They vanished from our lives like ghosts, moving into a cramped apartment on the other side of the state, their perfect reputation shattered in the eyes of everyone who mattered. But the real climax didn't happen in a lawyer's office or a courtroom. It happened in the quiet of Isaiah's bedroom on the last night of the month. I sat on the edge of his bed, the weight of the secret I'd carried for 11 years pressing down on me. I told him everything. I told him he wasn't just a good deed I found in a folder, but that he carried the same blood as the people who had been so cruel to him. I watched his face as he processed the fact that his grandparents had known he was their own flesh and blood every time they looked at him, and they still chose the cold garage over the warm dining room. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard. Isaiah didn't scream and he didn't cry. He just looked at his hands and asked, "Does that mean I'm like them?" It was a question that cut deeper than any insult my father had ever hurled. I realized then that the trauma wasn't just about the cold or the loneliness. It was the fear that he was inherently unwanted by his own kind. I took his face in my hands and told him that blood is just a map of where you came from, not a compass for where you're going. I told him that my parents' legacy was a house of cards built on money and pride, but his legacy was the strength he showed in that garage, a strength they would never understand. We sat there for a long time, just breathing in the reality that the war was over, but the healing would take years. I've spent the last few days completely rewriting my will and setting up a foundation in Isaiah's name, ensuring that the wealth my parents felt so entitled to will instead go toward helping other kids who have been discarded by families who value purity over humanity. My house is finally quiet and the locks are secure, but I sometimes find myself standing by the window, looking out at the street and wondering how many other families are sitting at beautiful tables while their own inconvenient relatives are tucked away in the shadows. I lost my mother, my father, and my sister this month, but as I watch Isaiah finally sleep without a nightmare, I realize I didn't actually lose anything that was worth keeping. I traded a lie for a very painful truth, and though the price was astronomical, I would pay it again tomorrow to see that look of peace on my son's face. The month ended with a light snowfall, the kind that covers everything in a clean, deceptive white. Looking out at it, I can't help but think about how many people prioritize the aesthetic of a family over the soul of one. My parents chose their bloodline, and in doing so, they lost the only person who actually shared it with them. I chose my son. In the end, we all get exactly what we deserve. They have their tradition and their pride in a lonely apartment, and I have a boy who finally knows he is exactly where he belongs. The world sees a broken family, but for the first time in 11 years I see a whole one. We are starting over, not as a branch of a rotten tree, but as the roots of something entirely new, and for the first time I'm not afraid of the winter.